Since glomerular filtration rate is largely a function of the pressure of the blood as it comes into your glomerulus, local regulation or autoregulation is going to be ways that right at the level of the nephron, you can regulate how much blood is coming into the glomerulus. And so one way to do that is to dilate the afferent arteriole, which allows more blood to come into the glomerulus, and also to constrict the efferent arteriole, which makes it harder for that blood to leave. So if you have a drop in glomerular filtration rate, each individual nephron will dilate that afferent arteriole, maybe constrict that efferent arteriole, and that will increase the pressure of the blood, increase that hydrostatic pressure inside the glomerulus, which will increase the filtration rate. Now, if that's not enough, you may need a whole body solution, right? And that means you're going to affect your entire body's blood pressure, and you can do that both hormonally in ways that we've talked about before, and also in terms of your nervous system, speeding up and slowing down your heart rate, things like that. And the juxtaglomerular complex is going to play an important endocrine role in responding to decreased glomerular filtration rate by trying to increase the body's blood pressure overall. And so this is a complicated figure from your book, but essentially central regulation can, if autoregulation is insufficient, lead to an endocrine response. So blood pressure drops, and we know this because glomerular filtration rate drops, and we can't bring it back up to where it needs to be with just autoregulation. Well, juxtaglomerular complex is going to produce renin, and renin does a whole lot of things. First of all, it triggers the formation of angiotensin 1, which then becomes angiotensin 2 in the lungs. And angiotensin, as the name implies, angio refers to blood vessels, tensin refers to tensing up, right, constricting. Your blood vessels are going to constrict, right? How do I do this? With the microphone, I'm having a hard time figuring out where to aim. So we constrict our blood vessels, and that is going to increase systemic blood pressure, and that's going to increase the pressure at your glomerulus, and therefore your glomerular filtration rate. This is also going to stimulate aldosterone secretion by the adrenal glands. And aldosterone is the salt-retaining hormone. It causes you to retain sodium, and retaining sodium means retaining water, right? Because water follows those solutes, and that means increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, increased glomerular filtration rate. These hormones are also going to make you thirsty, right? Which is going to increase your fluid consumption, which increases your blood volume, which increases your blood pressure, which increases your glomerular filtration rate. It's also going to cause you to increase antidiuretic hormone production, which causes you to retain fluids, which causes you to have higher blood volume, which causes you to have higher blood pressure. Now you will also have increased sympathetic firing, and that is a neural response rather than an endocrine response. These are tied together, and that is going to increase vasoconstriction and cardiac output by cranking up your heart rate. Right? Sympathetic nervous system cranks up your heart rate, and that is also going to increase your blood pressure, which will increase your glomerular filtration rate. The majority of your reabsorption is going to occur in the proximal convoluted tubule, and this means more than 99% of your glucose and your amino acids and all those things that are nutrients that you need. And also reabsorption of lots of ions. So sodium, potassium, magnesium, phosphate, bicarbonate, things like that you probably want to reabsorb. Although, whereas these nutrients above, you're reabsorbing essentially everything, how much sodium you reabsorb, for instance, is going to depend upon your need. You're also going to reabsorb a bunch of water. About 108 liters a day of water is being reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule. This is a lot of reabsorption. And largely, the way that happens is that we reabsorb nutrients like glucose or like ions, things like that, and those are solutes. and water follows those solutes back into the bloodstream. And so by virtue of pumping actively, this requires energy. Pumping those nutrients back into your blood, the water is going to follow. Secretion is the movement of stuff from the bloodstream into the filtrate. And again, often this is expensive. We're using pumps. This is stuff that was largely too big to move through at filtration, or for whatever reason it didn't move across in sufficient quantities. And this largely takes place in the distal convoluted tubule. So what are we getting rid of? Well, sometimes sodium ions or potassium ions, very often hydrogen ions, which, as you know, are responsible for our pH level. And so if our blood is becoming too acidic, one way we can deal with that is to literally just pump those hydrogen ions out in your urine, and also things like toxins or drugs that you've been taking. So again, primarily in the distal convoluted tubule. And very often reabsorption of one thing means secretion of another. So if we reabsorb sodium, let's say we're pumping out a bunch of aldosterone and that's causing us to reabsorb sodium. That sodium comes back because of sodium-potassium pumps, which we've talked about before. And that'll bring 3 sodiums back, but it'll pump 2 potassiums the other way. So aldosterone also causes the secretion of potassium, pumping it from the blood across the cells and into the tubular fluid. Your nephron loop, or sometimes called your loop of Henle, is this loop here that goes down usually into your medulla briefly. And it is responsible for additional reabsorption of water and also some reabsorption of sodium. And it does it in a unique way. So as you move down into the medulla, right, you can see this color getting darker here. What that's indicating to you is that we get saltier and saltier as we move down into the medulla. The extra cellular fluid, the interstitial fluid, gets saltier. So as this tube goes down, if it's saltier out here, water moves towards the salt, right? So water is going to want to leave that tubular fluid and come back to your interstitial fluid. So you reabsorb a lot of water just through osmosis. It's passive. So as we move down here, water leaves. Now that said, as water leaves the tubular fluid and solutes don't, the fluid in your tubes is going to become very concentrated, very salty. And then as we go back up and it becomes less salty out here, right, the water out here is going to want to go right back into the tubes. But you see this segment thickens up. The walls of the ascending loop become impermeable to water, so that even though water would want to come back in via the rules of osmosis, it can't, right? The ascending loop has an impermeable wall, at least to water. But it's still very salty in here, and so you actively pump sodium out of this ascending loop into the interstitial fluid again. And that does 2 things. One, it makes the stuff up here less salty, and I guess also causes us to retain some salt that we don't lose in our urine, but it also keeps the interstitial fluid out here very, very salty down in the medulla, so that as more urine comes down here in this descending loop, the water still wants to come out because it's still salty out here. That's called a countercurrent multiplication, right? When you have flow this way and a flow this way, and the flow this way pumping sodium out causes more water to be pumped back this way by your descending loop here. Now there are 2 kinds of water reabsorption that occur in your nephrons. And the first, which we've been talking about so far, that occurs in your proximal convoluted tubule and in the nephron loop, is called obligatory water reabsorption. This always happens. It has to happen. You cannot adjust this rate at all. And this is the vast majority of your water reabsorption. It recovers about 85% of your filtrate, right? So obligatory water reabsorption always happens, has to happen. You cannot adjust it. The rest of the water reabsorption, which occurs some in the distal convoluted tubule and then the rest in the collecting duct, is called facultative water reabsorption. And facultative water reabsorption you can adjust depending on your hydration level, right? If you've been drinking lots of water, then you may not need to reabsorb as much water. If you have not drank very much water and you've been out exercising and you're dehydrated, well, then you probably want to reabsorb a lot more in your distal convoluted tubule and your collecting duct. Again, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, you cannot adjust that. That is obligatory water reabsorption. So blue is obligatory, purple is facultative. Well, how, you might ask, does your body regulate whether you reabsorb a lot of water or just a little water in these places for facultative water reabsorption? Well, if you think back to the very beginning of this semester, you may recall antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone we secrete when we are dehydrated, and it causes us to reabsorb more water. It turns out this is where, right? And so if you're producing a lot of ADH, then you're going to have a lot of water reabsorption. If you're not producing very much ADH, you're not going to reabsorb a lot of water here, right? And so you're going to have a large volume of urine that is relatively dilute, right? Again, if we are producing a lot of ADH, then we reabsorb water in this distal convoluted tubule and this collecting duct, and so your urine ends up having a lot less water. So there's less of it, but what urine you have is much more concentrated. So this would be like your really, really, really yellow urine, or like first morning pee, right? Because you haven't had any water to drink all night, probably. Whereas this is what you see when you've been drinking lots of water and you're producing no ADH, lots of urine, relatively dilute. Well, how does antidiuretic hormone do this? Well, as we talked about in chapter 16, one of the ways that hormones can cause a response is by turning on a gene in a particular cell. And we know that genes code for proteins. And there's one particular protein called an aquaporin, which is a water channel. It allows water to move through a membrane more quickly than it otherwise would. ADH causes the cells in your collecting duct and distal convoluted tubule to produce more aquaporins, which allows more water to be moved across them and moved out of the collecting duct and distal convoluted tubule, and that allows you to recover most of that water and have less urine, and again, more concentrated urine. Well, what is normal urine like? Well, it varies a fair amount based on what you needed to get rid of and what you needed to keep in your blood. But the pH tends to be, on average, a little acidic, around 6, but not necessarily. It can range from as low as 4.5, fairly acidic, to as high as 8, which is actually a little bit alkaline. Specific gravity can range from 1.003 to 1.030. What is specific gravity? Well, it's essentially a measure of the density of the fluid, and as compared to just pure water. And fluid tends to be more dense when it has more solutes in it. And so 1.030 is much more dense because it has a lot more solutes in it than 1.003. This would be very, very dehydrated urine, very concentrated. This over here would be very, very dilute urine, right? It's almost essentially just water. The specific gravity is the density of whatever fluid over the density of water. So the specific gravity of water is 1, because it's same number over same number. This water content has a lot to do with specific gravity and the osmotic concentration, right? These are all tied together. The volume could be as low as 700, as many as 2,000 milliliters a day, right? Or a 2 liter a day. Color tends to be clear yellow, but again, that depends. Odor varies with composition. That strong urine smell tends to come with bacteria. So urine is sterile when it comes out, right? I wouldn't recommend consuming it, but it is sterile right when it comes out. That said, right after it comes out, it begins to collect bacteria because there's lots of good stuff in there. That urea is scrumptious to bacteria, and so they begin eating it. And as they metabolize it, the stuff that they produce as wastes are things like ammonia, which have an odor. And so that smell you associate with urine is really the smell that's associated with bacteria that are eating the urine and producing metabolic wastes. If you've ever had a diaper, a pee diaper from a baby sit around in a trash can for too long and then you've taken it out later, whew, smells a lot worse then than it did right when it came out. Blame the bacteria.